Mention the word Egypt and people will often think of the pyramids, the Sphinx and the River Nile. A land filled with ancient wonders that have withstood the test of time. A little-known wonder are the ancient Christians of Egypt, the Copts, one of the world's oldest Christian communities, who date back to the time of Christ. The word Copt is derived from the Greek word Egyptos, which means Egypt. It has since come to mean the Christians of Egypt. Christianity in Egypt, introduced by the Apostle St. Mark, has largely remained unchanged over 2,000 years. Copts have preserved their ancient language, their distinctive art and architecture and traditions. And for almost their entire history, Copts have been persecuted and discriminated against. In the 3rd century under Roman rule, Christians were tortured and forced to deny their faith. Emperor Diocletian was said to have sworn to kill Christians until their blood reached his horse's knee. And he kept his word. Christians in Egypt continued to be persecuted with the advent of Islam in the 7th century. Copts lived with dhimmi status, living within a system of political exclusion, economic exploitation, religious persecution, and social degradation. In recent times, Copts have been systematically targeted and persecuted. Their churches have been burned, their businesses and livelihood destroyed. Christians have been murdered in acts of terror, with the law often turning a blind eye. Countless young girls and women have also been kidnapped, raped, and forcibly converted, and married to Muslim men. It was hoped that the Egyptian revolution of 2011 would change things, but it didn't. Instead, the last few years have seen an escalation in attacks against Christians in what can be described as some of the worst persecution Egypt has experienced in modern times. But halfway across the world, a group of young, passionate Australian Copts are trying to change things. The Australian Coptic Movement Association, or the ACM, was founded in 2010 following the Naga Hammadi massacre, where gunmen opened fire on Coptic worshippers following a Christmas Eve Mass. The ACM is a community advocacy group that fights for human rights in Egypt and the Middle East by exposing the persecution suffered by Copts and other Christian groups, calling for their protection and advocating for greater political and civil liberties. By closely working with the wider Australian community, government bodies, the media and other human rights organisations, the ACM has grown to become one of the most active independent Australian Coptic organisations. Following the ACM's widespread awareness campaigns, members of Parliament have spoken passionately about the plight of Christians in Egypt.
That it is an outrage what has happened to your community. It is an outrage which should cry out to heaven for rectification.
We condemn the recent attacks on Coptic Christians in Egypt. We express our sympathy for Coptic Christians who have been the victim of recent attacks.
Copts make up between 5 and 10% of Egypt's population, but they are suffering persecution and they are suffering violence in a growing concern.
Media outlets, both locally and abroad, have reported on the ACM's activist campaigns, broadcasting the injustices suffered by Copts to the wider community.
Burning churches, mosques, schools, orphanages. What sort of peaceful protesters shoot point blank a 10-year-old girl in the head as she's leaving from Bible class?
The ACM's demands are moderate and legitimate, calling for Christians to be recognised as equal before the law, afforded the freedom to express their religion, language and culture without hindrance. Egypt as a democracy must recognise the fundamental rights of Copts within the very fabric of its society, in its constitution, through its laws, judicial system and its educational institutions. Christians in Egypt form the largest Christian group in the entire Middle East and North African region. Their protection is vital, not just for Egypt, but for the entire world. More must be done. The ACM calls on Western governments, including Australia, to speak out against the persecution of Copts and other Christians in the Middle East, and to grant them safe haven in instances where they've been forced to flee. The ACM aims to be a voice to the voiceless, to take their stories and plight to the Australian government and its people, for them to be heard. One voice, one purpose. Will you join your voice to ours?